کنفرانس‌های بین المللی با شرکت شخصیت‌های سیاسی، تحلیلگران، متخصصان و پارلمانترها درباره رویارویی مقاومت و قیام مردم ایران با دیکتاتوری آخوندی.
کنفرانس پیامدهای بسیج رژیم آخوندی برای شیطان سازی و اطلاعات گمراه کننده.
سخنرانی سفیر لینکلن بلومفیلد، معاون پیشین وزیر امور خارجه آمریکا، اسدی مکیب، نماینده پارلمان انگلستان.
سفیر لینکلن بلومفیلد، معاون پیشین وزیر امور خارجه آمریکا. در 30 خرداد 1360 حکومت ترور شروع شد. آنها راه خود را به سمت قدرت با شلیک هموار کردند. آنها انقلابی را ربودند که هرگز متعلق به آنها نبود.
آنها جاسوس خود اسدی را از بلژیک پس گرفتند. با معامله یک گروگان فکر می‌کنم این بخشی از داستان دروغ پراکنی است.
افرادی که سازمان مجاهدین را ترک کردند و میگویند من را در اتاقی نگه داشتند و از من خواستند به گناهانم اعتراف کنم، شکنجه شدم و نمیتوانستم آنجا را ترک کنم، در لیست حقوق بگیران وزارت اطلاعات هستند.
Turning now to Ambassador Blumefield. Ambassador Blumefield, you've conducted really extensive research on this subject, but you've also been the author of several books in this regard. In one of your numerous speeches, I'd just like to quote from one of your speeches at an event where you asked the question, why do they keep repeating these allegations and these falsehoods? Why are they seeking to discredit the NCRI and the MEK? And your answer at this particular meeting was the reason is always the same, to keep a weak and illegitimate regime in power. And I was wondering whether you would like to elaborate on the answer that you gave at this particular meeting, but also the connection between policy and disinformation.
Well, thank you very much, Azadeh, and it's an honor to be with all of you and with these distinguished co-panelists. I'm delighted to take that question. As you said, a dozen years ago, I started looking at this issue, just looking at allegations independently, because everything I saw on the web, I was the chairman of a think tank, and I looked at all the other think tanks, and they said the exact same thing, almost word for word. Don't go near them, they're terrorists. There is a psychological reason for that. They want to hear the White House or the State Department say it first before they put it in the headline of their story, but the story lives on. And so I've thought about this, and here are my thoughts. This is an American view. One is that, you know, when your child lies to you, you know they're lying. But this disinformation has been successful. What's the difference? And it seems to me that one party is going to try to deceive, but it only works if the other party wants to believe. I was the desk officer for the Pentagon when the Marines were bombed, when the embassies were bombed, when the hostages were taken, the TW-847. Rich Higgins, we helped send him there, a Marine, he was murdered. All of these traumatic events happened. They learned from that it actually works. Terrorism works. If they punch you in the face, you might steer clear. And when we got tired of that, along came the secret nuclear program, which all of a sudden became the one and only thing that matters, the nuclear program. I'll get to the disinformation in a minute, but even as the nuclear issue suddenly loses a little currency, now let's back and seize some hostages. Let's take this kindly Belgian aid worker, a Norwegian refugee fund, and let's, if they aren't scared by 40 years in prison, maybe 74 lashes will really scare them, and it did. And they got their spy back, Asadi, from Belgium by trading a hostage. That, I think, is part of the story of disinformation. When it comes to Iran, we don't have a narrative. We don't have a unified story of what happened. We missed a whole lot of formative things that happened. We didn't understand in Washington, who is the MEK? Ayatollah Khomeini wanted Masoud Rajavi and the MEK, these educated, young, bright men and women, he wanted them as part of his movement. They were with him in Paris. He talked about democracy. He never said anything about velayat-e-faqih. He never said, we're going to have a totalitarian one-man rule. He never said that until he got to Tehran. And then suddenly he had this constitution. People were afraid of the Basij beating people up in the street. Masoud Rajavi and his supporters, your families, stood their ground and continued to show up for the rallies. And it boiled, as you know, on June 20th, 1981, the reign of terror began. They shot their way to power. They stole the revolution that never belonged to them. The Americans missed this story. So, of course, if you see that you've gotten away with all of this, then you can propagate all sorts of narratives that can be believed. I studied the terrorism reports for 19 years out of the State Department. For the first part, they weren't so bad. But then along came the time when they put the MEK on the terrorism list in 1987. As Director Free just explained, the FBI wasn't consulted. It had nothing to do with a dossier of terrorism. The terrorism reports changed overnight. And of course, the newspapers printed it. So now time has gone on, and I have to say, we were right all along. I thought that our research was a little bit risky. You know, we're trying to say that we have different facts than the governments of the West are repeating. We can sit here now in 2023 and say we have been right all along. All of you have been right all along. The narrative that we uncovered, the narrative that I got by asking questions, and others have gotten, that Strawn Stevenson's books have described so well, was all true. And so I think I want to finish by saying disinformation won't work so well if the media keeps repeating it. So my appeal to you and to all the journalists here is that you must stop repeating things that you now know are untrue. You must stop. And we will keep telling you to stop. You cannot repeat these false narratives. You now know that the people who have left the MEK and said, I was kept in a room and I was asked to confess my sins and I was tortured and I couldn't leave, you know that they're on the payroll of the Ministry of Intelligence. Read the Antwerp court report when Asadullah Assadi was indicted. I will give it to you if you ask me for a copy. I emailed it to myself. This will describe the operation of Section 312 of the Ministry of Intelligence and Security across Europe, across the United States, across Canada. We are being influenced by agents of influence in our midst, in the universities, in the think tanks, and in some places in government. I think we can fix this, but we have to stand up for the truth. We have to point a finger. We have to demand that the media organizations have professional pride, do the brave thing. You're not going to get any more visas to Tehran. Sorry. Tell the truth. And when we do that, the regime will be exposed as the weak and illegitimate entity of ruthless and unprincipled people that they surely are. Thank you.
استیو مکیب، نماینده پارلمان انگلستان: دروغ و پروپاگاند جزو ماهیت این رژیم است و به همین وسیله هم باقی مانده است. این نقطه شروعی است که از همانجا انقلاب ایران را واژگون کردند.
ما با یک گروه از خلافکاران سر و کار داریم که در هیچ نقطه‌ای متوقف نمی شود. آنها هزاران و هزاران و صدها هزار دلار برای انواع مختلف کارزارهای دروغ پراکنی هزینه می‌کنند.
وبسایت‌های بزرگ و قدرتمندی هزاران هزار پیام را در روز پمپاژ می‌کنند و ادعا می‌کنند که از زنان و مردان عادی ایرانی منتشر شده است که برخی از آنها در آمریکای شمالی یا کانادا یا انگلیس یا سایر نقاط اروپا زندگی می‌کنند. از جمله نویسندگان ستون‌هایی در روزنامه‌ها که همه جعلی هستند و هرگز وجود ندارند.
Thank you very much. Turning finally to Steve McCabe. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us here this afternoon. We appreciate your participation here. During the recent uprising, numerous legislators and politicians were apprised of really a bombardment of literature against the MEK and the NCRI. And in a letter that you wrote to colleagues some years ago now, but I think it still continues to resonate, you said that colleagues would be contacted by people who purported to be ordinary Iranians living in the United Kingdom, and that they would be warned not to support the MEK. You have also mentioned that you have received over the years, but also more recently, a barrage of emails really to that same end, which is do not support the MEK and the NCRI, as opposed to really concentrating on the Iranian regime. Perhaps you could elaborate on whether you think this campaign has been successful, the disinformation campaign of the Iranian regime?
I think we have to start by acknowledging that it's almost in the DNA of this regime that it exists through falsehood and propaganda. That's its starting point. That's the starting point where it subverted the Iranian revolution, and that's the practice it's continued ever since. And it kind of essentially oscillates between brutality and violence and misinformation and covert activities, sometimes extending to blatant terrorism, as in the case of Asadi. And it seems to me everything I've heard this afternoon just confirms that nothing will ever change with this regime. I think that's the fundamental thing that Western negotiators, Western politicians, Western diplomats need to understand. We are not negotiating with normal political beings. We're not negotiating with people who observe any rules of diplomacy. We're essentially interacting with a bunch of gangsters who will stop at nothing. And it seems to me that is the fundamental starting point for this. And of course, they do spend thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars on different types of misinformation campaigns, huge big websites, Habilion and Farak, which pump out thousands and thousands of messages a day purporting to come from ordinary Iranian men and women, some of whom are living in North America or Canada or in the UK or elsewhere in Europe. Almost all fictitious characters. They're like these kind of people who write to agony ants who never existed, except they are much more dangerous. And certainly over the years, I've had a number of experiences like this. I remember I was in my office in the House of Commons, this is many years ago now, when I first became quite active with the Iran freedom movement, and I had a message from the desk at the House of Commons saying that there was an Iranian gentleman there, and he wondered if I could spare him a few moments. And of course, rather naively, I kind of assumed it was something to do with the NCRI. And it was only as I started to listen to this gentleman that I realized that it was a put-up job. I've lost track of the emails I've had purporting to come from honest, ordinary Joe blogs telling me about things that you know, allegedly have happened. The sort of things that Ambassador Blumenfield and Strawn have been describing that go on in the camps and things like that. And a number of other colleagues were placed on a sanctions list as a result of some of the criticisms we've made of Iran. I have to tell them it didn't quite work out the way they may have intended, because people in the UK Parliament think it's a badge of honour. And I actually have one friend who said, I don't think I'm on the sanctions list. I have one friend who said, I don't think I'm on the list. I think I better make my denunciation stronger the next time I speak to make sure. And that's what he promptly did. But, I mean, I think the point I would make is that we should not underestimate the power of these people. Sometimes, as I said at the beginning, they're based, it's in their DNA, it's a falsehood from the start. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's quite lightweight, you know, sending you emails purporting to be someone else. Sometimes when it comes to things like detaining people like Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, when it comes to brutalizing their own people, when it comes to carrying out acts of terrorism, it's anything but subtle. And the only thing I would say about them is this. There are two messages we should send to them. The first one is, as I say, these are not normal politicians or diplomats. These are gangsters. And we should respect the views across party of the British Parliament and ban the IRGC, just as you were suggesting should happen in Canada, Candice. We should absolutely ban it. And the other thing is, you will know that the sanctions, many of the sanctions against this regime are due to lapse in October. Now, I have just written to the British Foreign Secretary saying I hope he's going to put in place a series of measures to make sure these sanctions don't lapse, because if they do, we will be rewarding these people for what they're doing. We'll be rewarding them for the way that they're leading a propaganda campaign across the world, the way they're brutalizing their own people, and the way they're destroying every standard of civilized diplomacy and politics that most Democrats would recognize. We can't do that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to apologise for the fact that we are running out of time, so unfortunately I won't be able to open the floor to questions. However, I would just like to end by asking our panellists to give perhaps any final remarks, and I will start off with Struan.
Yeah, well, thanks to all the panellists for their remarks. We have a fight on our hands. And as I said earlier, I think this is a fight we're going to win. Who could say that Mrs. Rajavi's 10-point plan to restore democracy, peace, justice, women's rights, human rights, an end to the death penalty, an end to the nuclear threat, an end to the spread of aggressive war and terror in the Middle East and around the world, that would be a platform I would be proud to stand for election on myself. So this is something that we are offering 85 million impoverished Iranians as an alternative to the tyranny that they have suffered for 40 years. We need to stand up and be counted and tell the people of Iran that we are with you, we stand by you, we will not let this continue.
Thank you very much, Struan. And I believe Amnesty International has described those killings as a killing spree, which even by the Iranian regime's dire and despicable human rights record is a spike even in terms of their executions. Moving on to Candice Bergen, any final remarks for our audience?
Well, I as well want to thank the panelists. I learned so much, and it was great to be part of this panel. Steve, something you spoke about as a member of Parliament, and I've talked about my colleagues here, including Tony Clement, who's a former Conservative member of Parliament. I think what we're seeing in Canada as well is immense pressure and disinformation that's given to the bureaucrats and the civil servants who are advising our politicians and our government. But some of the biggest pressure that I've received, and I think my colleagues would agree, has actually been from the bureaucrats who would call us in and advise us to not be participants of this conference. So I think we have to be very cognizant. This isn't just a social media campaign or maybe journalists who are not always reporting the truth. There seems to be a pressure, so-called Iranian diplomats have relationships with our civil servants in our countries, and I think that they are many times advising our government leaders, just stay away from it. So again, we have to be strong and vigilant and stand shoulder to shoulder with MEK, with Mrs. Rajavi, with everyone who is working and part of the organization to free Iran. And I think civil servants are a big part of buying into that.
Thank you. Ambassador Blumenfield, are there any final remarks that you would like to share before we conclude?
I think we've seen, everyone has described a wall of propaganda that has been put up, a Berlin Wall, if you will. A few years ago, Madame Rajavi called it an obscuring curtain. It's the same concept. If this weren't Iran, if we weren't, as an American, traumatized by the hostage crisis and the terrorism and the nuclear proliferation, and we could just simply look at what was going on. Here you have an extremely well-organized movement with, by the way, very credible intelligence files. They've kept the file on this regime from day one. No one else has done that, to my knowledge. Maybe Director Free can correct me on that. There are governments that come to the NCRI and say, can you answer this, can you answer that? They have dossiers on people. I don't think we knew that Hossein Dagan, the first defense minister for Rouhani, was the brigadier who first trained Hezbollah to become fighters and who oversaw the operations that blew up the U.S. Embassy twice and blew up the U.S. Marines at Beirut Airport. And here he comes back in 2013, and we don't know who he is. I don't know how many women understand that Hassan Rouhani's job in February of 1979 was to go into the Department of the Army and enforce hijab on the women. And the point being here, if you just look at the NCRI and the MEK, a non-violent movement that is entirely intellectual, as Ron Stevenson, the 10-point plan has described so well. And then look at what's happening in Iran, where not only the women, if I may put it that way, but the girls have all turned against this government and said, we can't have it.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Director Free, may we have your final remarks, please?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Good panel and good discussion. As Link said, a lot of times propaganda is further promulgated because a free democratic media doesn't criticize, doesn't intervene, doesn't take a position. So I think we could do a better job of that in the United States. It's hard to imagine that there are people in the State Department and the West Wing of the White House who still think we can sign some type of credible, enforceable deal with a regime that, as you heard before, is run by gangsters and has no rules except their own. Our government, and particularly our leaders, should have been and should be forcefully and personally standing up for the young women, the young men who are being killed and slaughtered in Iran. This is a regime that is a murderous regime. It's pretty well doomed, by the way, a regime that is not supported by the people. The people see it as financially, politically, and morally bankrupt. It's not going to all of a sudden have a resurgence. It's going to get weaker before it collapses.